recording this event. Okay. And so we begin recording. So I want to thank everyone for coming here to this, our fourth in the Huessy events, sponsored by the National Institute for Deterrence Studies. For those that don't know who we are a national think tank. We are beholden to our principles of getting the word out on the importance of national security. Certainly the importance of our national deterrence through nuclear and through our nuclear deterrent, and most importantly, reaching everyone at nearly all levels, from senior level of leadership of our country down to every citizen, to let them know the value and importance of a strong national security. And this event, Huessy event, sponsored by several of our sponsors and headed by Peter Huessy, is one of our ways of getting the word out on what we do. We also have a journal called the Global Security Review that we publish. You should take a look at it. We have multiple, at least two podcasts. One, the NIDS View, which is topical, comes out weekly. We talk about events similar to this, and we talk about NIDS Knowledge, which is information about the nuclear deterrent, and piece-wise, 9 minutes of information that is meant to be knowledgeable, or added knowledge. But today's event is one in which we have a seminar with important speakers, Stephen Blank and Mark Schneider. And this is an opportunity for them to speak and for us to interact with them, unlike in a podcast. And so without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Peter to do an introduction on our speakers. Peter, it's up to you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Stephen and Mark, both of whom have been longtime speakers at this series. The reason is I begin the year with a threat series. The reason is the posture statement and the budget have not come out. So having members of the U.S. military, both Air Force and Navy, to talk about that, they have to wait until the information is on the street. I do want to mention the fact that we will have an Iran brief with Ms. Shoshana Bryan and Elon Berman. We will also have Matt Koslow and Rob Sufer talk about their study on integrated air and missile defense. Matt Kronig and Rob Weaver will talk about how do you deal with two-peer nuclear-armed adversaries that may very well we could describe as enemies, and how do you do that given the current U.S. Strategy and our capability, and particularly with reference to the amount of recommendations from the Posture Commission. And then Brad Roberts will speak about the gap we have in theater nuclear capability, both with respect to Europe, NATO, and the Western Pacific. And Mallory Stewart, we haven't scheduled her yet, but she is currently looking for a date to talk to us about arms control and verification from her post over at the State Department. And then Madeline Creedon will be talking as chair of the Posture Commission. She will be talking to us about what did they find and what do they recommend. And then we have scheduled Frank Miller first week in May on what the strategic environment for the United States is. We will then follow these with major military commanders from various elements of the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Navy. And then it will be followed by civilian officials in the Department of Defense, as well as then members of the United States Congress. We're going to start with my friend Mark Schneider, who years ago, Les Aspin told me that counting the Russian beans, in this case, nuclear stuff, is very important. And the second most important thing is what Steve Blank will do. Will tell you, why are they building these things and what are they going to do with them? So Mark, again, on behalf of NIDS, you've been a great friend and an extraordinary scholar in this business. Your publications under NIPP are first rate, particularly your last one you did on China. So it's over to you, sir, and welcome to the seminar.
Well, thank you very much. I think this is a very auspicious day to be speaking about this topic. And if you read the morning press, the defense minister of Denmark has predicted there's a possibility of a Russian attack on NATO in the next 3 to 5 years. And that's about a week or two after the German defense minister said 5 to 8 years. Either way, there will not be, probably not be anyway, a single new U.S. strategic nuclear delivery vehicle operational that we don't have today, and you're going to have force aging over this period. We also, in October, saw the U.S. Strategic Commission report, which is very much worth reading. It has about a dozen recommendations for beefing up our nuclear forces and about a similar number for beefing up our conventional long-range strike capability. Today, I'm going to talk about the recent developments in Russian nuclear capability, which are not included because of the timing in the report that National Institute for Public Policy published by myself on the Russian nuclear weapons capability in October 2023. Every year, Putin addresses the Defense Ministry board and talks about their accomplishments for the preceding year and what they plan to do in the next year. This year's, or December 2023 version had some very interesting statements. He talked about increasing reliance on the strategic nuclear triad because of the political situation in the world. He also said that the war in Ukraine would establish Russia's, quote, global sovereignty, which I don't think he's ever used that terminology before. He talks a lot about sovereignty in crazy sorts of ways, but what I think he's talking about is Russia's political clout and political military domination. High-level nuclear threats by Putin and his regime are very common. They started in 2007, and they escalated dramatically, both in severity and number, since his February 2022 invasion of Ukraine. This has included at least one statement by Medvedev threatening to wipe out the entire population of the world. So we are dealing with a country, and I think that Steve will talk more about this than I have time to do, that has an extraordinarily low nuclear weapons use threshold, probably the lowest in the world, but one that is also basically dominated by the Soviet worldview and is attempting to do a cut rate version of Soviet nuclear strategy, and would even much more emphasis on nuclear first use. Now, Putin in his statement in December before the Defense Board indicated that Russia in 2023 had the seventh Borei class ballistic missile submarine had become operational, and they'd introduced 15 new ICBMs, YARs, and the Avangard hypersonic boost glide vehicle. This is important because this is the first official confirmation of something that had been hinted at in the Russian press for years, which is they're going ahead with more of them than they had officially announced, that this was the third regiment of Avangard that they were talking about. Now, we get very little official information from the United States government concerning Russian nuclear capabilities. All we get is very ominous one-liners. For example, the Director of National Intelligence's statement to the Congress in 2023 talked about the continued risk of Russian nuclear escalation, stated that because of heavy losses and expenditure of precision munitions, quote, Moscow's ground and air-based conventional capabilities have been depleted to the extent that, quote, it's increasing its reliance on nuclear weapons. That's pretty ominous in light of what the pre-war Russian doctrine actually was. And last but not least, it states that Russia maintains the largest and most capable nuclear weapons stockpile, and continues to expand and modernize its nuclear weapons. So I think you need a lot more than this level of detail for the American population and the Congress to make sensible decisions in regard to nuclear deterrence, which I think, unfortunately, is not what's going on right now in the Biden administration. Now, in December 2023, Putin stated that Russia had achieved 95% modernization of its strategic nuclear forces. Historically, Stratcom has been maybe 5 percentage points below that, but that's essentially in the noise, and is probably definitional in nature. The plans for 2024, as announced by Putin and Shoigu, the defense minister, is adding the 8th Boreas, in this case a approved Boreas class submarine, and that they plan to put the new Sarmat heavy ICBM into operational service this year. Now, whether they do that this year or 2025 or even 2026, they're going to have a substantial number of these missiles operational prior to the first U.S. new strategic nuclear delivery vehicle as a result of the current U.S. modernization program, which is at best and very problematically very late in this decade, because 3 of the 4 U.S. strategic nuclear modernization programs are behind schedule, reportedly by about 2 years. Now, that's important because the program itself was pretty marginal to begin with. It's very useful to read the United States Strategic Commission report. I mean, this is really a bipartisan report, and it just struck me. I was amazed by how much consensus were developed between the Republicans and the Democratic commissioners, and the Democratic commissioners basically are a who's who of second level people in the Obama administration. So the commission came in with about a dozen recommendations to enhance the Biden administration program of record on our nuclear forces, and about a similar number of recommendations to enhance our long-range strike capability. Unfortunately, literally none of these have been adopted by the Biden administration, which is actually fighting efforts to improve our nuclear deterrent capability. Also, in December 2023, the commander of the Russian ICBM force, Colonel General Sergei Karakayev, stated that the Russian ICBM force had achieved a modernization level of 88%, and I don't think anyone would dispute that. The biggest short-term change in Russian strategic nuclear capabilities is going to be the introduction of the Sarmat heavy ICBM. Now, whether this happens this year or 2025 or 2026, this is a tremendous potential increase in capabilities. The Sarmat is over a couple of 100 tons in weight and has an announced throw weight of 10,000 kilograms. The Russian Defense Ministry says that it can carry 20 light or low, medium, or high yield nuclear warheads. That, I believe, is quite credible. If you take a look at what Soviet-era systems had with much less throw weight than the Sarmat, it's almost exactly what you would expect based on the throw weight increase. In addition to the Sarmat, the Russians have announced several new ICBM programs, including one to replace the new Yars MIRV ICBM. They also have announced a program to produce a follow-on a submarine-launched ballistic missile to the Bulova 30, which is being deployed right now on the Boré-class submarines. They also have another submarine-launched ballistic missile program called the Huessy, and recently they've been referring to it as the Arcturus. The shipyard that builds their nuclear submarines recently talked about it in public, and it's described as a large boomer type submarine, not quite as big as the Boré class. So there were some reports of this being a small 4,000 to 6,000 ton submarine. Apparently are not true. I never thought they were credible because it's not something you would do. The Russians are also in the process of bringing the improved version of the Tu-160 bomber into operation. It has the ability to carry a wide variety of nuclear weapon systems. In addition to bombs, it carries long-range nuclear cruise missiles. It's reportedly going to carry the Kinzhal air-launched ballistic missile and the new hypersonic air-breathing systems the Russians are developing. The PAC-DA is in much earlier stage of development. It's a stealth bomber. It's the only area where we may actually get I'm pretty sure we will get a U.S. system before the Russians do. So the Russians are increasing dramatically their number of nuclear weapons. They've suspended, quote unquote, suspended the New START treaty, and we haven't had an inspection since March 2020. They could have, in that time frame, easily uploaded their entire strategic nuclear force to its maximum potential, or whatever part of that they see as desirable. And there's no way to accurately assess that without inspections. We still have a handle on maximum capability, but the number of deployed weapons supposedly in a downloaded configuration is not something you can do without on-site inspections. Bill Gertz in 2017 said that the Russians are going to 8,000 nuclear weapons, and Rear Admiral retired Peter Fanto in 2019, when he was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Nuclear Matters, confirmed that number. So there's no question there's going to be a large increase in Russian capability, and a lot of it may have already happened covertly because of the lack of any ability to inspect Russian missile systems. The Biden administration is clinging to the hope in nuclear arms control that's going to solve all our problems. It's very, very unlikely that we will see any new agreement anytime in the foreseeable future, and the Russians, in all probability, are exploiting the absence of inspections to achieve higher levels of nuclear capability than any they have generally given credit for. In my recent monograph of National Institute for Public Policy, which is entitled "How Many Nuclear Weapons That the Russians Have," I review all of the existing estimates on their capabilities. In particular, I take issue with the Federation of American Scientists' annual report, which I believe grossly understates what either their current capability and their breakout capability is. Then they create the impression that they know the exact number of Russian nuclear weapons, when everything we have today, and there are a wide variety of estimates, are estimates. They are not facts. But unfortunately, most of the uncertainty is on the upside. And with the lack of any confirmation by the Pentagon, the classified number for Russian nuclear weapons, total nuclear weapons, dates from 2012, and it's obviously wildly out of date. So it's essentially useless. Last thing, I'm running out of time. So last thing I just want to mention is non-strategic nuclear weapons. That's prominent in the current Ukraine crisis situation and a lot of the Russian nuclear threats. The standard assessment is that they have a 10-to-1 advantage. If you take a look at what they actually say about their reductions, it's 25-to-1. If you take a look at the high estimates of what their non-strategic nuclear weapons capability is, it could be as much as 50 times. And it's not just the numbers. It's they have everything they had during the Cold War, and it's worse because they've actually added new capabilities, in particular the hypersonic missiles they didn't have during the Cold War, and they've actually increased their nuclear weapons production capability in the 2018, 2019, to the point where they can replicate the entire U.S. nuclear force in a couple of years. There's no reason to do that, to actually increase their capabilities, unless they're planning a significant increase in the numbers compared to what we routinely see in the press, which in almost all cases is just reciting the Federation of American Scientists numbers, which, as I said in the monograph, there's simply close to zero documentation of any of the things that drive their analysis. It's possible that they may have the approximately 6,000 nuclear weapons the FAS says they have, but it's also possible they have at least twice as many weapons as the FAS gives them credit for, and the highest in this run about 3 times. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark Schneider. Dr. Blank, I met Steve at the Army War College up in Pennsylvania, and listened to him speak about Russia, I think back in the 1990s. And as he was talking earlier, he got it right many, many decades ahead of time. But he's now going to tell us, what are the Russians going to do with the weapons they have? How is their nuclear strategy influenced by what has happened in Ukraine?
Thank you, Peter, and thank you. It's hard to follow Mark, as always, but I'm also going to address something different than what Mark is talking about. Mark gave you an excellent briefing as to what they're doing, how much we think or may know in some cases of what they have. I'm going to try to address the question of why. And I want to also recommend to our audience, if you are seriously interested in these questions, if you want to know how the Russians think about deterrence, and that's not only nuclear, it's conventional, it's informational deterrence as well. I strongly recommend to you a recent book by the Israeli scholar Dmitry Adamski. I'm going to be reviewing it for parameters shortly. It is first rate about what the Russians think and how they think about these issues. I'm going to talk to you today about what they are doing. And as Adamski admits, there is generally a gap between what the Russians are able to do and what they think or what they want to do. This is typical in Russian history throughout the 20th century and now, but it's essential to understand how and why they think the way they do in order to understand why they do the things they do. So, that in mind, let me address first the question that Mark talked about in the second half of his presentation: arms control. Most objective people, and I've talked to a number of people in the Biden administration also, if they're hoping for arms control, that's not really what the policy is. They have internalized the idea that there's not going to be any arms control negotiation for the balance of this term, and whoever's elected president in November, his or possibly her term going into the next couple of years. Number of reasons for this, mainly because of Putin and his policy. But even if Putin were to disappear tomorrow, magically. That would still be unlikely. There are a number of reasons that you have to understand why nuclear weapons continue to maintain the priority they have in Russian thinking and in actual budgeting and procurement, which is, anybody will tell you the budget is policy. It's what they do. It's what they're going to put money against. First of all, nuclear weapons are a talisman of Russia being a great power, which is an obsession. And I don't use that word facetiously. We are talking about a group of obsessed people. If you watched the interview with Carlson last night, or if you've read Putin's speeches or watched him speech or listened to Kremlin spokesman, this is obvious. And this obsession pervades Russian elites and culture. That Russia must be a global power. That also means an empire, hence the war in Ukraine. And to prove that they are, and they have to prove to themselves all the time that they are, much like, say, in a fairy tale, the wicked queen has to keep asking the mirror on the wall, who's the most beautiful woman of them all? Russia has to say, who's the greatest power of them all? We are, because we have nuclear weapons. As a result, they have more nuclear weapons than anybody else, by whatever standard of accounting you're using. Second reason now, their conventional arsenal is and has taken a beating in Ukraine. The figures that are coming out, and those two are estimates, of the losses of men and the losses of equipment will take years to recapitalize under the best of circumstances. And we cannot foresee the best of circumstances for Russia. It is entirely possible that they will lose the war. It is also possibly, particularly if they lose the war, that there'll be an upheaval in Russian politics of some sort. We don't know how or what or who, but likely. The economy is now closely resembling the old Soviet economy, which is over-militarized and permanently overheated as a result because of the amount of government spending, which creates enormous inflationary pressures, which the government has to suppress artificially. If that stops, then those pressures come apart, and conventional weapons are even more, and manpower are even more expensive than nukes. But third, because of China, a factor that Mark did not mention. Now, the institute which we happen to write, one of the institutes we happen to write for, both of us, National Institute for Public Policy, published a monograph, a retort or an analysis of the National Posture Review by a bunch of distinguished experts. One of them, Ashley Tellis at the Carnegie Foundation, the Carnegie Endowment, makes the point that China is building hundreds of nuclear weapons. Now, we've heard about this from Admiral Richard when he was head of CENTCOM and other high-ranking generals, that the Chinese are building hundreds of nuclear weapons. They are going to be our equal numerically very soon, and potentially Russia's, because, again, nobody really knows how many there are. But the fact of the Chinese building these nuclear weapons necessitates that Russia also build nuclear weapons in deterrence, despite the alliance, and I think it's an alliance between Beijing and Moscow. Because the Russian Far East, if you look at the map, is what analysts call an economy of force theater. It can only really be defended by nuclear weapons, because the Chinese could cut the logistic umbilical cord to the heartland of Russia within a day. That's the Trans-Siberian Railway. So the only way that they could sustain that area against the Chinese army, if that contingency came to pass, is by building nuclear weapons. They are not going to say that China's an enemy. There's a taboo, actually, on saying things like that. But planners understand this and have to budget accordingly. So there are several reasons besides what Putin is telling us about our relationship with Russia, why arms control should not be expected, and certainly cuts in nuclear weapons. Now, why are they building so many nuclear weapons? I gave you one answer. The second answer, that is the great power obsession. The second answer is They have to do so because they're going to have to recapitalize their entire conventional suite as a result of this war. Win, lose, or draw. Third, you have an extraordinarily powerful nuclear lobby in Russian politics and in the army that is able to secure funding at a high rate for nuclear weapons, given the function that nuclear weapons play in Russian strategy. Here I can give you an anecdote. In 1976, when I came out of grad school, I applied for a job at the CIA, and I even got an interview. And the gentleman who was interviewing me said, we have a question here, whether the Soviets are building nuclear weapons for some ultimate rationale or because that's what they do. That's the way the system is set up. I thought that was the craziest question I'd heard yet as a young graduate student, but it also showed that we think in terms of either or instead of both and. Both reasons are correct. Yes, they do it because they're set up to build them, and it's easier, and they have the bureaucratic and factional clout to get the resources they need to do it. And second, they have strategic reasons. Today, they have strategic reasons because, as General Baluyevsky admits, Russian weapons are inferior to NATO conventionally. And since NATO, if it were to get its act together, is conventionally, and the United States for that matter, is conventionally superior to Russia, nuclear weapons are the only weapons of deterrence. Now, when I say deterrence for Russia, I do not mean what you might think is deterrence. And you need to read Adamski's book to get a full clarification of this. But they use the term deterrence in a completely different fashion, and we just don't have the time to go into that today. But for your interest, you have to understand how they think, because as we all know, the adversary has a vote. Nuclear weapons are, for Russia, a deterrent to NATO and American conventional superiority, particularly in wars around Russia's borders, such as we've seen, but even more so because it allows Russia, nuclear weapons are, for Russia, warfighting instruments. We don't have any controversy in Russia about sole use or the idea that nuclear weapons are only good for deterring other nuclear weapons. You hear that a lot in the United States. It's an extremely uninformed view, and it's very ethnocentric. They build nuclear weapons for a reason beyond all the reasons I've given you, because they are warfighting weapons to preserve Russia's opportunity to expand the empire and deter NATO in doing so. It's a little known fact, for example, that before the war in Ukraine 2 years ago, the Russians conducted a series of naval and air exercises outside Russian Federation, surging both the fleet in the Black Sea and the Mediterranean to deter NATO from trying to get into the Black Sea, and also to threaten the sea lines of communication with Europe. That means the Arctic fleet surged into the North Sea. They conducted exercises. They were in the Irish Sea. You may remember there was a controversy because they cut Irish fishermen's trawler lines and so on. This was in preparation for a potential first strike if NATO responded in February 22 to a Ukraine attack. And that is canonical Russian doctrine, that nuclear weapons, particularly TAC nukes, are to be used in military contingencies, particularly in a limited fashion, although we have no idea that a limited use of nukes would stay limited, in order to deter the West from responding to Russian military activity, particularly around its frontiers, which, of course, are always expanding. And as a result, the power projection mission, if you are following Russia, what they're trying to do, let's say now in Africa, potentially in Latin America, certainly in the Middle East, the power projection movement campaign that they're waging on a global scale has as one of its critical objectives the attainment of military bases from which they can deter the NATO nuclear and naval capabilities. Lavrov actually saw the base in Angola last year. Why the Russians need a base on the South Atlantic is a mystery, other than to fulfill the function I've just outlined. They sought bases all over Africa also. For example, the base in Sudan that they've been trying to get contained an agreement for allowing nuclear-powered ships to berth there, which means boomers, or conventional smaller ships, but with nuclear-capable missiles, because all Russian missiles now are dual-capable. So the power projection capability and rationale is connected to nuclear. And that gets me to a third point. Nuclear weapons are not thought of in a category distinct from conventional. Here, we have a cottage industry that talks about nuclear weapons separately from conventional weapons. I'm not criticizing anybody for it. It's just a fact of life. That's not the way the Russians think. They see this as a continuum or a spectrum, if you like. And if the spectrum gets to a certain point, it may be desirable to use limited nuclear weapons in order to show that they mean business and that they will not accept attacks. Yesterday, when he said to Carlson that if NATO forces were to come to Ukraine, it would mean a disaster for the world, what he's talking about is nuclear weapons. So he's prepared to nuke Ukraine to keep it out of NATO. This is reminiscent of, movies where the bad guy says to the woman victim, if I can't have you, nobody will, or, blow up the whole universe. So we've seen already that there are 3 or 4 rationales for nuclear weapons that go beyond anything that's in American thinking as use for nuclear weapons. And particularly the TAC nukes are therefore intended for potential use if deterrence as conceived of by Moscow fails. There are 2 other purposes, and I've addressed this in a number of articles. If you want to read them, one of them is the most recent, and I think the most comprehensive, is in the Naval War College Review from last year, the spring of 23. The conveyance of the threat of nuclear weapons to the West is an information operation. And I don't mean that, again, just in a sinister way. It's conveying a threat. I'm telling you, and I'm conveying to you the information that I am prepared, under certain circumstances, to use nuclear weapons against you. And it has succeeded brilliantly in Ukraine because the United States government and NATO are still inhibited from sending certain kinds of weapons to Ukraine, lest that be seen as escalatory. As a result, the Russians have escalation dominance in Ukraine. No matter how you assess the war, in other ways, they have retained escalation dominance, which I think is a fundamental strategic error on our part and for which we are now paying. You may see something like that in regard to Iran also. We don't want a wider war in the Middle East, and therefore we are pulling our punches with regard to the attacks by Iran and its proxies on us and on the Israelis. And thirdly, beyond information operation, to convey to you a certain kind of information that will lead you to do things that are not in your interest, at least as far as Russia understands them, is that it is also a weapon of reflexive control. Reflexive control is a term that comes out of Soviet psychology, and it was moved into military thinking. It is an attempt by the Soviet and now Russian military leadership to set up situations, provide information, set up situations that will lead an enemy to act in Russia's interest, even though it appears to him or her that he is acting in his own interest. It is creating a false picture of the reality with which you are presented. So the nuclear threat is that, God forbid, you do something, you escalate in Ukraine. Well, we are going to do this, and therefore you pull your punches and you exercise a restraint that has cost the Ukrainians and our own interests dearly. That again shows that nuclear weapons are thought of in terms of war fighting, in this case in the information domain, not just in the kinetic domain. So I've outlined several reasons here why the Russians are wedded to the idea of nuclear priority. They have to defend against China as well as NATO, and particularly the U.S. They believe they can only deter NATO and the U.S. around their borders, or China for that matter, by the threat, the credible threat of nuclear use under escalatory regimes. Furthermore, they are determined to project power abroad, and they're determined to create the image, if not the reality, of being a great global strategic power. All these phenomena come under the rubric of what the Russians call strategic deterrence. Strategiczое stężenie. Again, Adamski goes into this. I discuss it. Other people have written about it as well. And these are all part of the policy of strategic deterrence. In effect, almost all of Russian military policy can be put into that rubric. However, I do not want to leave you with the impression that we're dealing with some sort of strategic mastermind. We are not, because they are so desperate to be seen of as a great power that they are desperately seeking an alliance with China. I think they have an alliance with China, but the Chinese also are using this to take advantage of the situation. And one way in which China is taking advantage of the situation, which is not well known, is the fact that Russian uranium production is now going in large measure beyond what is needed at home, or what Rosatom, their atomic energy agency, is trying to do to sell reactors abroad, is going to China, particularly enriched uranium, U-235, which is used for nuclear weapons. In other words, the Russians are becoming a major provider, a source for the development of the Chinese nuclear arsenal, which is a threat to Russia as well as to us. They need the money, they need the alliance, and they need China to recognize that they are, to use the German term, bündnisfähig, worthy of an alliance. In my mind, therefore, this alliance with China resembles in rather unhappy ways the alliance between the Habsburg Empire and the Hohenzollerns before 1914, where the Habsburgs had to keep proving to themselves that they were truly a great power and they weren't going to take any nonsense from anybody. We know the results of that. It is entirely possible that Russia's aggressive policy could lead into a major crisis, even though the Russians certainly don't want it, and neither do the Chinese. Therefore, we've got to pay much closer attention to what Russia, as well as China, are doing in the nuclear sphere, and be able to deter them by the enhancement of our own capabilities, such as was called for in the Nuclear Posture Review. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I have a couple questions from our audience. Well, Mark and Steve, you can take them both if you'd like. One is, if Russia has economic pressure on it and doesn't have the budget it needs, will that affect its modernization of nuclear forces, or do the nuclear forces kind of get what they get and everybody else is in second place? The second question is, Mark and Stephen, do you have any specific recommendations of how you could undo or check Soviet escalation dominance in Ukraine? And the third question is, Mark, you mentioned early on that the Russians are doing some new things but is there anything new in terms of technology or strategy that is markedly different than what previous Russian administrations like Yeltsin stuff or during the Soviet era? How is there that change? So either one of you can take those three questions, however many you want, and we'll start with Mark.
Okay. In terms of economics, from the very beginning of the Putin regime, strategic nuclear forces were the highest priority, and there's no question about that. That's where the money goes. At one point, very early in Putin, 95% of Russian military modernization went to the strategic nuclear forces. That's changed a lot since then because they've increased the capabilities. I mean, the emphasis and the resources that goes into it. One side effect of the mobilization for the Ukraine war is that roughly twice as much of the GNP is now going into defense than ever before under Putin. And this will, I believe, will continue after the end of this conflict. So in the long run, we're we are facing a higher level of Russian investment in military capability than we've ever seen before. As for escalation, how can we do it? Well, read the commission report and read an article I did on this on the commission report. You can literally double or close to it the U.S. nuclear forces in less than a year if you upload the bombers and upload the ballistic missile submarines. It takes longer for the ICBM force to be uploaded, but that can be done too. Now, Putin basically has terminated the New START treaty. He's quote suspended it, quote unquote. That's illegal, and if it's actually a material breach of the treaty, so you could basically undertake the options that are available under international law, which includes U.S. suspension and upload, which is reversible if Putin never changes policies. But the effect of this would be a dramatic shift in the very short term at virtually zero cost toward the United States. And strangely enough, if you look at the Federation of American Scientists analysis, they say we upload gives us a 2-to-1 advantage over what the Russians can do. I don't think their assessment's accurate, but certainly we're in the worst of all possible worlds. Right now, when we're restricted seriously by New START, and Admiral Richards said at one time that it cost them 2/3 of his nuclear weapons, and the Russians are not. I mean, there's Rose Gottmauer in 2020 basically said that everything in terms of New START verification depends on on-site inspections, that they deliberately did it that way. Well, the effect of that is that we have no real handle on whether the Russian missiles that were downloaded to comply with New START haven't been uploaded. And even if they started, say, in March 2022, when it became clear that this was going to be an endless war, they could have uploaded it at the majority, at least, of their strategic nuclear forces. Now, what was the third question? I can't recall exactly what that was.
It had to do, Mark, where you said early on that the Russians are doing some new things, but are they strategy-wise much different than previous Russian or Soviet?
Yeah, I mean, the stuff which I have characterized as crazy in the past, the nuclear-powered cruise missile and the nuclear-powered drone submarine, which I think are very dangerous systems. We've already seen multiple accidents with a cruise missile with small amounts of contamination, and fortunately they flew for very short periods of time, so you didn't have a lot of radiation built up in the reactor before it crashed. But there's a real possibility that that with a test of either of these systems, if it was almost successful but not quite, you could have a mini Chernobyl. And the Soviets never did anything like this, and certainly Yeltsin regime didn't.
Stephen.
Yes. Let me start with the first question. I agree with Mark. The nuclear weapons will get the priority of whatever is available. And now, that does not mean they will achieve all their goals. We've already mentioned this a lot. Many of these programs are way behind and have failed to be tested and so on. And Russian defense industry is notoriously inefficient and corrupt and so on. Nevertheless, they have an enormous defense industrial complex, and they will get at least a significant part of what they're investing in. So the nuclear weapons will remain the priority, especially because the conventional forces have been so beaten up in Ukraine. Now, second, how do we retaliate or escalate? It's very simple. The Senate did it yesterday. You pass the bloody bill that on aiding Ukraine, and you keep sending Ukraine the weapons and supporting it, because that way you maintain conventional deterrence in Europe, without which nuclear deterrence is not going to do you much good. Because if Ukraine falls, nuclear threats will multiply, and demoralization will set in. So the point is to support Ukraine and ultimately turn the tide and win the war. That way you can restore deterrence at its lowest level, which is conventional deterrence. And you therefore negate the possibility of them using nuclear weapons as threats because they can't carry out anything at the conventional level that is sufficiently threatening. That also means, besides supporting Ukraine to the extent that's necessary, and 60 billion is a good, down payment on that, is also fundamental rearmament of Europe. Now that's starting, but it's nowhere near what it should be. And I mean, we've been calling for this for years, but the problems in Europe are immense. They can't get a European defense industry going. Everybody's got his own defense industry, and there are all kinds of obstructions and problems and what have you, depending on which country you're talking about, because Europeans didn't want to believe that war is still a reality in international affairs. Sadly, it is. Second, okay, now a third rather, strategizing. Yes, they are trying to build some new things, and technology is constantly changing. They want to go into space. They are collaborating in space with China, or at least they said they will be. We have already talked about the fact that they're collaborating with China on nuclear weapons in this kind of suicidal quest for an alliance, so they could play the great power game. And they are going to invest a lot in artificial intelligence and hypersonics. Now, the danger also, is proliferation. I mean, one of the things we have not mentioned here is that Russia, by virtue of its failure to win in Ukraine, is now breaching non-proliferation treaty requirements. First of all, it broke the non-proliferation treaty by invading Ukraine. That's in plain English if you read that treaty and the Budapest Accords. But giving China uranium, there are reports, I don't know how true they are, but there are reports that they have given North Korea hypersonic technology or missile technology. They've certainly apparently helped satellite technology in North Korea. Iran is going to want something for its support of the Ukrainian war effort. And this leads to serious threats to the non-proliferation order. And let's be frank, I have an article coming out soon. If Iran gets a nuclear weapon, Saudi Arabia will go for one too. Maybe Egypt, Turkey as well. Well, that's 3 countries to begin with. Israel probably already has several nuclear weapons, although nobody discusses it anymore because they're not a threat to anybody. So we've driven a tank through the non-proliferation treaty if this sequence goes through. So those, I think, are answers to your questions.
I wanted to turn it over to our president, Jim. Do you have any? You had a couple of questions, and I kind of stole them from you. But do you have any further upgrade, or anybody in the audience? If you have something for our 2 speakers, please let us know and hit the chat function and ask away.
Well, thank you, Peter. Yeah, for highlighting this. Yeah, if anyone has any last minute questions, please put them on the board. That's the joy of doing the seminars like this, is that you get a chance to interact and hear from our speakers. What an excellent a bit of information to get from you. Again, if you do, we almost need to have people come in on an early, come in 15 minutes early and hear our speakers. I think it's the second time that we've had some really good dialogue before the talk that just led into the talk and the seminar and afterwards. Gentlemen, I can't thank you enough for the time that you spent with us today and helping us with our seminars, getting the word out and highlighting an extremely important and often misunderstood area. I have a new last question, so I'll go ahead and ask it, Peter. Based on what Stephen just said about Iran, what should the U.S. preemptively strike Iran's nuclear infrastructure? So I'll pass that on to you guys to talk a little bit about Iran before we close this out.
Let me start. I would have done so when we had the opportunity last week. I would have done it. We know where it is. Nobody else has the capability we have to do it. Yes, that would have certainly enraged Iran, but it would have sent an unmistakable signal to everybody in the Middle East that you are not to trifle with the United States, and that we mean business, and that we're prepared to take control of the escalation ladder. Because if you control the escalation ladder, you can impose deterrence.
Right now, my priority for a strike on Iran would be the cruise missile and the UAV production capability. You take that out, and they can't sell them to Russia anymore because they won't have them. Two, they can't supply their proxies in the Middle East with these weapons, and so it's a double advantage for the same. The same use of force.
I would agree. I want to take the chance to thank Alex Littlefield, who is our chief of staff of NIDS and is great help in putting these seminars together. I do have one more question. It's not usually talked about, but Putin, whenever he talks about transferring weapons to Belarus, he comes across and he says, if you don't want them in Belarus, you have to take them all out of Europe, meaning American theater forces. So it's kind of a clever backdoor way of saying that Russia gets to have nuclear weapons adjacent to NATO, Europe, but not the United States. So our theater systems, if based in the United States, of course, can't strike Europe. They have to be brought over. And so it's kind of a way for him to get Europe to disarm of theater nuclear weapons. Am I off base on that, Mark?
Well, I think you're correct. That's what he intends it to do. The dealing with Belarus is, I think, something we have largely ignored. I mean, their current involvement with Russia and they're serving a base for the invasion of Ukraine is a very significant political military development. So we need today war plans against them. It's not only the tactical nuclear weapons that they've transferred, it's the overall use of their territory for offensive Russian actions now and in the future. I don't think the actual the current regime in Belarus is not going to get directly involved in fighting NATO or Ukraine and take the losses, but they're serving as a base for
Yes.
The Russian capability. And it means you got to target them.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, anyway, thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Mark. Thank you all for the audience. Our next event will be on the 23rd of February. It will be with Shoshana Bryan and Elon Berman. Shoshana is with the Jewish Policy Center. Elon is with the American Foreign Policy Council. They will be talking about the Iranian nuclear threat and its implications for U.S. security. We look forward to seeing you then. Alex can send you the link if you don't already have it. And again, I want to thank our president, Jim Petrosky. Thank you for this. And again, my sincerest thanks to you, Stephen and Mark. I rely on you both for a good deal of work and help, but you really are a gold mine of information. And on behalf of NIDS and the Huessy events, thank you, gentlemen, very much. We will talk later.
Thank you all.